Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at doingsofdoyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 34. This time we accompany Holmes and Watson to Switzerland for a showdown with Professor Moriarty in the adventure of The Final Problem from December 1893. And here's Paul to introduce the story that needs no introduction.
Following his marriage to Mary Morstan, Dr. Watson has lost touch with the routines of Baker Street and is somewhat surprised when a dishevelled and agitated Sherlock Holmes appears on his doorstep in the spring of 1891. Seeking a temporary haven and trustworthy company, it appears that Holmes has become embroiled in a perilous contest of wits with one Professor Moriarty, a mathematical genius and unlikely kingpin of London's criminal underworld. His duel with Holmes is reaching its crisis, and the great detective seeks a European retreat while the police round up the Professor's gang. He also requests Watson's company, despite the journey's inherent danger.
The adventure of The Final Problem has probably the longest gestation period of all the Sherlock Holmes stories, the novels included, and the writing history is a little convoluted as a result. But fortunately for us, as in so many cases, the great Doylean scholar Richard Lancelyn Green went before us, and in his book, The Uncollected Sherlock Holmes, he gave a very good summary of the story's development. Now, as we know, and we've mentioned in previous podcasts, Conan Doyle had long harboured a desire to kill off Sherlock Holmes. He'd originally toyed with the idea while coming to the end of the adventures, and he was dissuaded from doing so by his mother, who instead offered the suggestion of a story based on a lock of hair. That story became The Copper Beeches, the last of the adventures, and on completing that story in January 1892, he wrote to his mother, "So now, a long farewell to Sherlock Holmes. He still lives, however, thanks to your entreaties." But Conan Doyle's respite didn't even last a month, because Greenhouse Smith was soon on to him to request a further 12 stories. Conan Doyle proposed an outlandish fee, £1,000, which is roughly 150,000 today, and was surprised when it was accepted. But even by September 1892, he was again thinking of killing off Holmes. J.M. Barrie recalled a conversation that they had at the seafront at Aldborough about Sherlock Holmes' imminent death. Aldborough being a location more associated with M.R. James than with Conan Doyle. And that the idea of killing off Holmes was at the forefront of Conan Doyle's mind is further corroborated by the account of Frederick Villiers, the celebrated war artist and correspondent for The Graphic, who had covered, among other conflicts, the Second Afghan War. He gave a lecture in Upper Norwood in December 1892 and visited Conan Doyle to find that Conan Doyle was planning Holmes's demise. It's from Villiers that we get this quote that Conan Doyle said, "A man like that mustn't die of a pinprick or influenza. His end must be violent and intensely dramatic." And Villiers wrote, "I could see that my dear friend of many happy monthly parts was doomed. The author of his being was inexorable on this point, and I left the house with a touch of sadness in my heart." So April 1893 comes round, and Conan Doyle wrote to his mother to say, "I'm in the middle of the last Holmes story, after which the gentleman vanishes, never more to reappear. I am weary of his name." But the precise method of disposing of Holmes was still to be decided. The solution came 4 months later in August 1893, when Conan Doyle and his wife Louise departed on a lecture tour and holiday in Switzerland. And among the party were the novelists Silas Hocking, the supernatural story writer E.F. Benson, and the Reverend William J. Dawson. And the Conan Doyles and Dawson visited Meiringen, the Gemmi Pass, and the Reichenbach Falls, which later led Dawson to describe himself as an unintentional accomplice in Holmes's death. But it was later in the same holiday that the method of killing Holmes really came into sharp focus. And that was when Conan Doyle visited the Findalen Glacier with Hocking and with Benson. And Benson brought up the subject of Holmes, and together they debated the detective's fate. It was Hocking who apparently suggested that Holmes could come to Switzerland and fall down a crevasse, which he said would save Conan Doyle on funeral expenses. And we don't really know when the Conan Doyle completed the final problem, but it was most likely immediately on his return to England, because at the end of August 1893, he wrote to his publisher to ask that the second series of stories be called The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, and they include the final problem. And that was the same letter in which Conan Doyle asked that the cardboard box be expunged from the memoirs, which we might talk about another time. Now, the story first appeared in the Strand in the UK in December 1893. Although many American readers might have already caught up with the story, unlike the rest of the memoirs, McClure's had the rights to Final Problem, and the story was syndicated in US newspapers starting around the 26th of November. For his part, Conan Doyle laconically recorded the event in his notebook with two simple words in December 1893: killed Holmes.
Yeah, so there are a number of very interesting points come from this discussion. I mean, you've mentioned Doyle talking about the death of Holmes to J.M. Barrie and Villiers, and these are men who are very much in his own set. But when you come to the August trip to Switzerland, it's a bit of a strange setup because it's a kind of semi-religious convention. I mean, W.J. Dawson, or the Reverend W.J. Dawson, was the editor of The Young Man, which was a magazine that had a mix of adventure stories, but also improving articles. And he had actually asked Doyle to write an improving article, as it were, on his literary heroes. And you've also got Silas Hocking is another a Cornish writer of essentially morality tales.
Yes, yeah.
Very, very popular writer, all but forgotten now, but in his time, hugely popular. So you've got this kind of semi-religious group, and it's not entirely clear why Doyle was invited along on this trip. He was there to lecture. He gave his favourite lecture on George Meredith. But perhaps they saw Doyle, through his influence with Sherlock Holmes, as an influencer of people generally, and perhaps young people in particular. Because Holmes, although he is an ambiguous character, there's a real streak of morality.
Yes, absolutely.
Runs right through him. So people like Hocking and Dawson will see Holmes as a character who's in the right.
Yeah.
So perhaps this is why Doyle's invited along. And the other one who you mentioned there, E.F. Benson, Edward Frederick Benson, was the son of Edward White Benson, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was also along on this trip with his wife, which is why E.F. was there, or Fred, he was known as. One of the three Benson brothers, all of whom became famous writers. A.C. Arthur Christopher Benson, who actually wrote the words later on for Land of Hope and Glory.
Yes.
There was the youngest brother, Robert Hugh Benson, R.H. Benson, who famously converted to Catholicism, became a Catholic priest, and was a great apologist for the Catholic faith. Edward Frederick, Fred, was rather lighter.
Yes.
In his literary touch. This is in August 1893, this meeting. He'd actually become a literary sensation in May 1893 with the publication of his first novel, Dodo, which was a light society humorous novel. And Benson was a great fan of Oscar Wilde and saw the success Wilde was having with this sort of material. And so he wrote this novel Dodo, which was just a massive success because it parodied lots of famous people in London society.
Mm.
And there was the fun of playing the game of Who's Who.
Yes.
And there was scandal came out of this as well, and Fred got himself into some hot water. Um, but as you mentioned, his other famous writing, besides these kind of camp society novels, was his supernatural writing, and
Mm.
he could write some very, very dark ghost and horror stories. And so 1893 is a major year for Benson, because you've got the publication of Dodo in May. He's along on this trip in August. He's there at
Mm.
the kind of the
Mm.
decision-making process about the death of Sherlock Holmes. And then later the same year, on the 28th of October, he is present at the 601st meeting of the Chit Chat Society at Cambridge University, at which M.R. James, a good friend of Benson's, reads out two of his to become very famous ghost stories, Canon Albrick's Scrapbook and Lost Hearts.
Mm.
So
Mm.
Benson is by chance
There at the
present at
time.
two great literary events.
Yeah, and it seems that Benson and Hocking and Barry and the like were all quite surprised to hear that Conan Doyle was intent on killing off this great literary creation that had been such a part of his financial and critical success. And the public reaction to the death of Sherlock Holmes was quite pronounced. I mean, we often talk about how shocked everybody was, although something that we often overlook is the fact that his death had been quite well trailed. On the 30th of September, the Pall Mall Gazette had broken the news that Sherlock Holmes was going to die under its literary notes column. It wrote, "We're in a position to announce the approaching decease of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, and are not by any means sorry to do so. Dr. Conan Doyle does not intend to write any more detective stories, and we are glad to hear it. He can do far better work." And Matthias Bostrom has quite rightly, I think, spotted that the source of that story is almost certainly Conan Doyle himself, since the sentiments exactly mirror his own. But also the Strand sister publication, Titbits, it trailed the death of Sherlock Holmes, saying that the Strand Christmas edition would feature a story on that topic. And in fact, once the final problem had come out, Titbits ran a memorial prize for Sherlock Holmes in January 1894. But it's definitely the case, even though some people will have picked up on the impending demise. There was a zeitgeist moment, or a sort of water cooler moment, as we might call it now, where everybody is hearing the news at the same time. And Conan Doyle himself, in Memories and Adventures, admittedly writing from 30 years on, said, "I was amazed at the concern expressed by the public. They say that a man is never properly appreciated until he is dead, and the general protest against my summary execution of Holmes taught me how many and how numerous were his friends. You brute was the beginning of the letter of remonstrance which one lady sent me, and I expect she spoke for others besides herself. I heard of many who wept." And there's a whole mythology has now grown up around the release of the final problem. Um, and it's very difficult to really get to the bottom of whether or not there's any truth here. It's claimed that the royal family were distraught. There were claims that the Strand magazine had lost 20,000 subscribers overnight. And probably the most notable is the claim that clerks in the City of London wore black armbands, which I think many people have now debunked, or at least nobody has yet found any evidence to support it. And I think it was Phil Burgum who noted that the earliest reference to the armbands comes in John Dixon Carr's biography of
Mm.
Conan Doyle, which means it's almost certainly an invention of Adrian's
Hmm.
put in.
There's also this air that you get reading Conan Doyle's comments about this is there is a great degree of disingenuousness going on here.
Yeah.
I was surprised at the public response. He won't have been. He used his mother as a kind of barometer, and she's constantly, "You can't kill him. You can't kill him. You
Yeah, yeah,
mustn't.
yeah.
You can't." So he knows this. He gets this from people like Barry and Villiers, no doubt Benson and Hocking
Mm,
and Dawson, they'll all have said, what do you think you're doing here? You've got a nest egg here. You've got a character. You've got what most authors would kill for,
mm.
which is this hugely successful character that the public absolutely love. So there's yeah, definitely this sense with Doyle of disingenuousness and bloody mindedness
Yes.
with what he's doing.
And that really hits at the heart of one of the big questions about the final problem, which is, did Conan Doyle ever really intend to kill off Sherlock Holmes for good? I mean, was this intended to be his final end? Because I mean, Conan Doyle claimed as such, but you know, famously, we don't have a body, and nobody is
Mm,
discovered in this. And even at the time, some of the newspaper reviewers were pointing out that the Lloyd's Weekly, 17th December 1893, time will show whether the famous detective is really lost after all. And Chicago Tribune, same day, saying he's probably not really dead, but in hiding and will
mm.
come forth in some future story as brilliant and full of vitality as ever. So it's even contemporaries were saying, "Is this really the case?"
Yeah, I mean, if he'd really intended to kill him off, there would have been absolutely no uncertainty. Watson would have seen the corpse.
Yes,
Yeah, and he'd have certified death or whatever. Doyle is very much hedging his bets here.
yeah,
He knows that if he should need money in future, here's the obvious way to raise it very quickly is
mm.
to bring back Holmes, and it's very pertinent in this discussion when he does bring Holmes back for the first time in The Hound of the Baskervilles, dipping his toe in the water.
Yes, exactly.
Setting it before the Reichenbach Falls,
Mm,
but there's no reason why he couldn't have set a whole series before the Reichenbach if he wanted to bring him
absolutely.
back. And there's also right at the beginning of the final problem, when Holmes goes to Watson's home,
Mm,
he's frightened of air guns.
yes,
We get no mention of Colonel Moran,
no,
but already the air gun is there.
yes.
Had Doyle, in his own mind, been preparing the empty house even at this stage?
Yeah, and I think that this might be a bit of a stretch, but I'll go for it anyway, which is that, that famous final line about the best and wisest man I've ever known. Lots of people have commented that this is a paraphrasing of a line from Plato's Dialogues from Phaedo, which is on the death of Socrates. Socrates having been sentenced to death and then ultimately carrying it out by as was the Athenian way in drinking hemlock. But Plato's comment on Socrates was that such was the end of our friend, who was, as we may say, of all those of his time whom we have ever known, the best and wisest and most righteous man. And the significance of it is that Plato's discussion of Socrates' demise is really all about immortality and reincarnation of the soul. And I do wonder if there's something going on unconsciously here about the fact that at some point this character could come back. I mean, we know Conan Doyle was interested in Plato. We know he'd read about Plato's immortality of the soul because it comes up in the Captain of the Pole Star apart from anything else. So maybe there's a little unconscious clue that somewhere in the back of Conan Doyle's mind he's thinking I'm going to keep this door open.
It's probably good to put the final problem within Conan Doyle's literary context
Hmm.
at this time. His so-called better things,
Yes.
because there's a lot of things at this time he's producing. We talked about earlier things like Raffles Haw. He's just done The Great Shadow, which has its moments. It's not a great work.
No.
Wonderful description of the Battle of Waterloo, but it's a very varied work in terms of its quality. Now
Hmm.
he might have argued, well, perhaps this work might have been better if I wasn't getting distracted by
Yes.
writing Sherlock Holmes, and this might be another reason why he wants Holmes out of the way so that he can then concentrate fully on by better things. I always presume he means his historical fiction, his kind of idea of wanting to be almost another Walter Scott.
Yes. Yeah.
And he just sees these frivolous detective stories, or as he sees them, frivolous detective stories. They are, of course, a lot more than that.
Yes.
As distracting him from that.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
no doubt is the sort of argument he would have used when his mother was
Yes.
trying to persuade him. Don't kill Holmes off. Don't kill the goose that lays the golden eggs.
Yeah. I think probably the most tangible example of this, often quoted phrase from Conan Doyle that Holmes takes my mind from better things,
Mm,
is the refugees, because he was writing the refugees at the beginning of 1892, right at the point where he's put to bed the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, and he gets this offer from Greenhow Smith, which turns his head. The money turns
mm,
his head, and he accepts it. And we know from the episode we did on refugees that the writing of that story was problematic. It took him a long time, and at the end of the day, he wasn't very happy with the result.
mm,
So I think that's probably the only sort of real tangible example of how Holmes did actually impact on his writing process, because he writes plenty of other good things around this time. He writes Lot 249, Jellen's
mm,
Voyage. As you say, I mean, I think he's really thinking back to Micah Clarke in 89 or White Company in 91, and thinking, this is really where my heart and
mm,
my future lies.
mm. And as well as the literary context of this time, there's also an awful lot going on in his personal life
Mm,
that's distracting him or involving him in other areas. Late 1893, he joins, for instance, the Society for Psychical Research,
mm,
so showing his interest in matters occult and spiritualist, and not only very strong but growing.
yes,
So that is something he is going to develop. But then at an even more personal level, October 1893 is the death of his father,
yes,
who has been in a number of different institutions over a number of years for his alcoholism and later epilepsy.
mm,
And this has been in the background of Doyle's mind an awful lot, and it's crept out in his writing on a number of occasions. The reference, for instance, in The Sign of the Four to Watson's alcoholic brother.
mm,
Same year as The Sign of the Four, you got The Surgeon of Gaster Fell,
mm,
which is a definite reference,
yes,
literary reference to his father.
yes,
1891, A Sordid Affair. There's no doubt about that being shadowed discussion of the life his parents had led in
mm,
Edinburgh, and
mm,
the problems his mother had experienced, having to look after an alcoholic husband and bring up a young family. So this is very much in the background for Doyle a lot of the time, and then suddenly his father's not going to be there anymore,
yes,
and you're then going to get a period of reflection.
yes.
Will come later, but all these things are happening at once, and then he has another major source of family worry also comes up in 1893.
Yeah, of course, and that's the diagnosis of Louise with tuberculosis, and this is one of the really interesting little details in the final problem I've never really got to the bottom of, in that you know various sources attribute Louise's diagnosis with tuberculosis being shortly after the return from Switzerland, so that would be end of August 1893. Some people say sometime it was shortly after Charles Doyle's death in October. But either way, they're putting it pretty much around the time that the final problem is finished, and sent to the publishers, or thereafter. You then have that interesting bit within the final problem itself, where Moriarty's ruse to separate Watson from Holmes is to put in Watson's way an appeal for help from an English lady, quotes, in the last stage of consumption. It appeared that within very few minutes of our leaving, an English lady had arrived who was in the last stage of consumption. She had wintered at Davosplatz and was journeying now to join her friends at Lucerne, When a sudden hemorrhage had overtaken her, it was thought that she could hardly live a few hours, but it would be a great consolation to her to see an English doctor, and if I would only return. And this is really quite chilling because um, if Conan Doyle know that Louise had tuberculosis? In which case, why is this detail in the story? It seems incredibly insensitive if it was. Or is it the case that he unconsciously knew that she had tuberculosis or sensed it, and this was coming through in his writing? I mean, he has been criticised by various biographers for not spotting her condition because obviously he traveled to Vienna to look at
Mm.
the one of the cures and he was familiar with the disease, but it's always been a particularly tragic detail, although of course there is the possibility that since Davos Platz was the location where English consumptives went to recover, it may just be that he's picking up on what was happening around him. But either way, I think it's an interesting little detail in the
Mm.
story, and one that
Mm.
is still quite perplexing to this day.
Mm. Mm. Now, one of the problems Doyle had, having decided to kill off Sherlock Holmes, was, of course, how to do it
Mm,
and what would be the method. And as he mentioned in the comment you referenced earlier, Mark, he has to be dramatic.
yes.
It's got to be big. He can't be, you know, killed off by a Jeffro Rucastle or somebody like that, or get run over by a hansom cab. It's got to be more dramatic, and there has got to be something behind it.
Yeah.
And so he came up with the character of Professor Moriarty.
Hmm.
Now, where do we think he came up with this character?
Yeah, so this is really interesting, isn't it? In that there are quite a few suggestions for it, but the best evidence really comes from Gray Chandler Briggs, who was one of the early Sherlockian notables who had been in correspondence with Conan Doyle, and through his correspondence had established that Conan Doyle had shaped this great character of Moriarty on the villain Adam Worth, who we actually
Mhm.
mentioned before in the episode on the resident patient, but an
Mm.
American criminal, probably most notable for the theft of Gainsborough's portrait of Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, which he kept for 25 years, and but also had tunneled into a bank,
Mm.
which may have inspired the Red-Headed League. And there is a very good book on Adam Worth from Ben McIntyre called The Napoleon of Crime, The Life and Times of Adam Worth, Master Thief, which came out in the late 90s. But there are other suggestions, including from contemporaries. There's one in the Pall Mall Gazette on the 18th of December 1893, where a correspondent suggested that Moriarty may resemble another forgotten villain, Ferragu from Honoré de Balzac's Histoire des Treize, in which Ferragu is the head of a secret order called the Deverins, the 13, which has got lots of sort of connotations of secret societies and from the Napoleonic era. So you can imagine how that might have appealed to Conan Doyle. But of course, Conan Doyle was not a great fan of Balzac. He actually wrote in Through the Magic Door that um, there is Balzac, for example, who with his 100 odd volumes, I am told that some of them are masterpieces and the rest potboilers, but that no one has agreed which is which at all. So I suspect it probably wasn't that source of inspiration. I mean, the other source that often comes up is the fact that Moriarty is an Irish name as well.
Yeah, the Irishness of his name is possibly suggestive, because we have had a period of Fenian activity in London throughout the 1870s and 1880s. So there is this possibility of connection that in his mind, um, Doyle is connecting these sort of secret societies, and
Mm,
Moriarty's own organisation is essentially a freelance organisation who
yes.
help out anyone who's up to bad things. But to sort of counter that, is the suggestion that's been made a number of times from Doyle's school days at Stonyhurst. There were two brothers Moriarty
Yes.
that he knew, and one of whom, James, was very talented at mathematics.
Mm.
So that may be the source, and simply the Irishness being connected to Fenian activity or secret societies might just be a kind of latter day way of reading this.
Mm. The other source, of course, is Major Drayson as well.
Mm.
Himself a mathematician and commenting on the dynamics of an asteroid as such.
Mm, mm, mm.
I mean, I think we're probably in agreement then, though, that the out of all of those things, Worth is probably the most
The
likely.
likeliest.
Yeah, and
Mm.
there is an interesting connection there back to that old Duchess of Devonshire portrait there, in that when Granada came to adapt the final problem, they have Moriarty steal a portrait in at the beginning of the episode, and also they put Moriarty as the agent behind the Red-Headed League as well. But thinking more broadly on Moriarty, the thing that's very obvious from, I think, the way he's presented in the final problem is that he is just conceived as a direct opposite of Sherlock Holmes, to the extent where his organization and the functions it fulfills are essentially for the criminal fraternity what Sherlock Holmes and his consulting practice does for good, honest folk seeking solutions to their problems. And the thing I'm always struck by with the final problem is that we only really have the measure of Moriarty from what Sherlock Holmes says.
Mm.
We don't actually see him at work as we do in the Granada series, in the
Mm.
Red-Headed League, and at the beginning of the final problem. We actually we only have Holmes's account for it, and even the confrontation in Baker Street is recounted to Watson by Sherlock Holmes. So you get
Mm.
these layers of ambiguity around the character of Professor Moriarty, and there are lots of myths again that are built up around Moriarty. My favourite being that he is a professor. I mean, we regularly call him Professor Moriarty, but Sherlock Holmes describes him very specifically as ex-Professor Moriarty of mathematical celebrity. And there's that wonderful moment where in the confrontation, where he describes him as Mr. Moriarty. Brett particularly brings out that in his performance, where it's Mr. Moriarty. He's going to underscore the Mr.
Mm.
bit just to make sure that Moriarty doesn't get away with any more credit than he deserves. So Moriarty is very much a sort of MacGuffin. He's a tool designed to do a job, which is ultimately to polish off Sherlock Holmes. And we only have really Holmes's word for it, and this creates this interesting opportunity that Moriarty may not be what he seems. Probably the person who's best explored this is Nicholas Meyer in the 7% Solution, which Moriarty turns out to be the Holmes boy's tutor, mathematics tutor, and the whole instance around Final Problem are wrapped up with Sherlock Holmes' drug addiction. So it's one of the nice things about the Final Problem is that we don't really get to see who he is in this. I mean, obviously he comes back in the Valley of Fear. We get more of a sense of Moriarty's capabilities in the Valley of Fear, but everything in the Final Problem is really reported.
Well, you only get two possible glimpses that Watson has of is essentially a tall, well-dressed Englishman.
Yeah.
Is briefly at the station, and then briefly again when Watson's on his way back to Meiringen,
Yes.
and he sees a man in black wandering up towards the Reichenbach Falls, who may be Moriarty.
Yes. And somewhat
Mm,
brilliantly
mm,
doesn't
mm.
doesn't question who this person is. But there you go.
And to come back to your point there, Mark, about him not being a professor anymore.
Mm.
There's a point specifically made that after his dismissal from his professorial chair, one of the ways he makes his legitimate living is as a mathematics tutor
Yes.
to candidates for the army, a crammer, as they were called,
Mm.
who would be brought in to help the young men who are having problems with their exams or have failed their exams.
Yeah.
And this was particularly for places like Woolwich and the corps like the artillery and the engineers.
Mm.
Conan Doyle's own brother Innes was actually trying to get into the army in the late 1880s, early 1890s, and had failed his initial exam,
Mm.
and he moved back to Portsmouth to go to the grammar school there and to be crammed
Yes.
for his exams. And interesting, his mathematics tutor there was one Alfred Wood, who was a cricketing friend of Conan Doyle's and would later also become his secretary. So
Indeed.
is Moriarty a kind of a fun in joke at Wood's expense,
Yeah, good point.
to a certain extent, but certainly the crammer element of Moriarty's job must be kind of a little jokey reference to
Absolutely.
Innes and his problems.
Yeah.
He did pass in the end and did go to Woolwich and graduate into the artillery.
Yeah, and whether he was a sort of in joke or not, the one thing that you can definitely say about Moriarty is that he is a brilliant and long-lasting innovation in popular literature. Really, I mean, he is the archetypal arch nemesis supervillain in the way that we hadn't really had before, and it's probably one of Conan Doyle's three great gifts to popular literature.
Mm.
Is that the first is that he modernizes, updates, and codifies the modern detective story. The second is that he creates serial characters, and that whole popular serial form. And the third is that he effectively invents the supervillain.
Yeah, it's and almost accidentally,
Yeah.
because the thing about Moriarty is that he is literally this kind of shadow character,
Hmm.
because he's created for a purpose. He doesn't develop organically, as it were. He is created for the purpose of getting rid of Sherlock Holmes in the most dramatic sense, but also by somebody who is Holmes's equal or can be seen as Holmes's equal.
Hmm.
So he has to be this kind of double. I mean, this is the first thing that Conan Doyle really ties into one of the great sort of figures of 19th century fiction, with this idea of the double or the doppelganger.
Yes.
And he is Holmes if Holmes had become a criminal, essentially. I mean, even physically, they're both lean, gaunt, ascetic types. So they're similar physically, and it's this kind of zeitgeist thing is going on. You've got 1886, Robert Louis Stevenson doing Dr. Jekyll and Mr.
Hmm.
Hyde. It's a very Scottish thing as well, because earlier in 1824, James Hogg produces this kind of odd Gothic thriller, The Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner, in which a Puritan fanatic, Robert Ringham, is pursued by a doppelganger called Gilmartin, who might be the devil.
Mm.
And again, later, mid-century, you've got William Wilson by Edgar Allan Poe, another story
Yeah.
of a man haunted by his double. So Doyle is really tapping into this with the character of Moriarty and making a real point about his suitability to destroy Holmes.
Mm.
But then there's also the elements you've mentioned earlier with literary background. You've got Farragut might be an influence, and more particularly Adam Worth,
Yes.
and Doyle ties this all together brilliantly. One of his great skills as a writer was always as a synthesist,
Yes.
and this is what he does with this character, and creates this sinister other version of Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah. And this goes on to, as much as Sherlock Holmes is a huge inspiration for generations to come, Moriarty is in his own way, just as just as important. We even use the phrase, a Moriarty to describe
Mm,
somebody's nemesis. I mean,
mm,
it's seeped into popular culture almost as much as Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson.
mm. And this happened quite early as well. Once the final problem is out there, and other writers see this and this is a good idea,
Yeah.
to have this huge secret sinister organisations headed by an even more sinister individual, and probably the first to really successfully exploit this was the Australian writer Guy Boothby,
Yes.
who had
Yeah.
the character Dr. Nicola. And again, note the name Nicola. Like Moriarty, it ends with vowel sound,
Yes. Yeah.
which is always this kind of sinister. You earlier had Wilkie Collins with Count Fosco,
Yes.
and obviously Count Dracula comes
Mm.
later. It's this kind of vowel sound. It's very it's not Anglo-Saxon.
It's Orient, isn't it? Really?
It's given this sinister feel. And Nicola first appeared in A Bid for Fortune in 1895, and then it stars in 4 sequels.
Yeah.
Hugely successful character, and showing the success of this sort of character ideal. Um, and then later on, 1913, we perhaps get one of the most famous, which is the appearance of Dr. Fu Manchu,
Yes.
the evil Chinese genius invented by Sax Roma. And it's telling, actually. If you go to the first Fu Manchu novel, The Mystery of Dr. Fu Manchu, the opening is hugely similar to The Final Problem, where the narrator of these stories is Dr. Petrie, who is
Yes.
very much another version of Dr. Watson. But the Holmes character is Nayland Smith, Commissioner Nayland Smith of the Burmese Imperial Police. Um,
Played by Douglas Wilmer a couple of times.
Absolutely, yes, yes. And he suddenly appears in Petrie's apartment from nowhere. And Petrie says, "I was too surprised to speak. No doubt you will think me mad," Nayland Smith continued, and dimly I could see him at the window peering out into the road. "But before you are many hours older, you will know that I have a good reason to be cautious. Ah, nothing suspicious. Perhaps I am first this time." And stepping back to the writing table, he relighted the lamp. It is almost the final problem
It is.
opening
Mm.
rewritten. And again, the character takes off so well. There are another 12 Fu Manchu novels, and they're in a class of their own in many ways, because there's an overtly racist overtone to
Yes.
them. So they're gearing at a similar but different market to the Sherlock Holmes stories. But it just shows that Conan Doyle had really started something with Moriarty.
Mm. And with Fu Manchu and Moriarty, I suppose the next one is going to be Blofeld
Oh, absolutely,
and Bond.
Fleming was a definite fan of the Sherlock Holmes stories, and again took the lessons of Moriarty, and what Fleming did differently was the one thing that Doyle is really vague about, is the organisation that
Yes.
Moriarty runs. It's got no name. It's just this freelance organisation for crime and chaos, essentially.
Mm.
And what Fleming does is he gives his organisations names. The first is Russian run, SMERSH, Spionum, Death to Spies. And then later he comes on with the more famous organisation, Spectre, which stands for the Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, and Extortion. And interestingly, their badge is an octopus.
Ah.
The many tentacles, and this Nayland Smith uses the same metaphor for Fu Manchu. His tentacles are everywhere. And if you think back to The Final Problem, Moriarty is similarly seen as 8-limbed. There's a
Mm.
spider at the center of his web,
Yes.
radiating his evil along the web.
Yes. And there's another parallel, I suppose, with the Bond stories in that Fleming himself wanted to finish off Bond and actually made several attempts.
Yeah, see, the first one he tried was in From Russia with Love,
Mm.
published in 1957,
Yeah.
where at the end of the novel, Bond is apparently killed by a poisoned knife in the boot of the Smersh assassin Rosa Klebb.
Rosa Klebb, yeah.
And there is a sense that this was a real attempt by Fleming to rid himself of a character he was already fed up of
Mm.
and just bored. He had that kind of mind, Fleming, where he was easily bored by things, even though again it was bringing in money and helping his comfortable lifestyle.
Mm.
But you also sense that like Doyle, he probably wanted to be known for writing more serious things. He was a journalist in his day job, and his brother Peter Fleming was a very renowned and respected travel writer,
Yeah.
and Ian was looked up to Peter in many ways and wanted to be like Peter. And the only two non-Bond books that Fleming wrote were this sort of genre, the Diamond Smugglers and Thrilling Cities.
Yes.
But people wanted Bond.
Yeah. Yeah, and you see that travel writing appear in the Bond books as well. I mean, they're very much sort of travelogues in their own way.
It's aspirational
Yes.
writing,
Yeah.
which again is very different from what Doyle was doing. Doyle was in many ways providing a kind of a comfortable idea that there's chaos in the world, but there is this man who can bring order out of chaos and make sense out of chaos.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas in the Bond books, Bond frequently just adds to the chaos.
Yes. Yes, that's true. That's true. So in many ways, the final problem is an enormous influence on popular culture in the 20th century. But it's quite an unconventional Sherlock Holmes story. I mean, this is a Sherlock Holmes story where ultimately there isn't a case, there isn't a client. I mean, the closest we get to a case and a client is actually to Sherlock Holmes and his own the peril he himself is in, um, and that has often aroused sort of quite mixed reactions to this as a Sherlock Holmes story. So what's your take on it, Paul?
I really like it. I do think it's a really great, almost self-contained tale.
Hmm.
Little mini adventure story.
Yes.
It's not a detective story, as I think many people have pointed out, because all the detection that Holmes is doing in investigating Moriarty and his gang is it's all done off stage. You've really got to take Holmes's word for an awful lot in this, as you've pointed out. You know, it's the whole reliable, unreliable narrator thing
Yeah.
with this one. It's Watson is simply reporting what Holmes is telling him. It's a very different story to many of the others.
Mm.
But I like the pace. I like the idea. I do love this idea of this mysterious organization. And although, as I've said, Moriarty is created just for this one purpose, it is quite astonishing how much you can get out of this character.
Mm.
And it is this almost accidental development within this whole genre. I think it's an endlessly fascinating story.
Mm.
And again, to come back, I absolutely adore the Granada adaptation because it is set. It moves. It's a story of movement
Yes.
as well, and it's a chase narrative.
Well,
It's got so much going for it. I think yes, there are these faults that it's just a story that a lot of people would argue was cobbled together for a purpose. But by God, it's a sophisticated one.
yeah, and I think also, I mean, just listening to the way you describe it, then it is a prototype thriller.
Mm,
It's a very early. It's got much more in keeping with the thriller genre than it does the detective genre, and maybe that's where people feel a bit uncomfortable around it. But I mean,
mm, mm,
I also think that it is uh, part of the fact that it is a manufactured story, it is manufactured for the purpose,
mm.
is is part of its great strength. I mean, it always feels to me like it's a kind of best of in a weird kind of way, or a sort of season finale, as indeed it was in as an
Mm.
early serial form. But you have a lot of this kind of world building that is reinforced. Again, you've got
Mm.
Watson talking about his marriage and how little he's seen of Holmes, and then you have the return of Mycroft, though we don't
Mm.
realise it's Mycroft until after. We have a classic reprise of Sherlock Holmes is in disguise and Dr. Watson doesn't realise who it is.
Mm.
You get this kind of the things that only ever happen in the last episodes of series, like Baker Street is on fire. So and then you have all these wonderful missing cases that sort of show that Holmes is certainly at the peak of his career, these missing cases in Scandinavia and France.
Mm.
So it's a story where the stakes are so much higher, and yet it doesn't conform to the pattern of the detective novel. And that's perhaps why people have been a little more, perhaps why it gets a bit of a mixed reaction. Although I think, diehard Sherlock Holmes fans still have this as a favorite.
Mm.
This is not one anybody's going to dismiss from their top 10 easily, I don't think. So that brings us to the end of this episode. If you want to read the show notes, you can find them at doingsofdoyle.com. And if you are enjoying the podcast, then please leave us a rating or review, or consider sponsoring us on Patreon or on PayPal. You can find more details at the website. But what have we got on the podcast next time, Paul?
Well, next time it's a complete change of mood, where we're studying the story A Literary Mosaic, which is otherwise known as Cyprian Overbeck Wells, which gives us quite a few ideas about Conan Doyle's own reading.
Yes, indeed. So that will be out at the end of next month. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye.
And what Fleming does is he gives his organisations names. The first is Russian run, Smush, Smert Spionum, Death to Spies. And then later he comes on with the more famous organisation, Spectre, which
we rehearsed this and we still don't remember the acronym.
Spectre, which stands for the Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, and
Extortion.
The Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, and Extortion.
Can you do it again? Because your internet broke up. Sorry.
Oh, okay, yes. Third time lucky. Which stands for the Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, and Extortion.
We can do a deal! I'll buy you a delicatessen! In stainless steel!
All right, keep your hair on.
Put me down! Put me down!
Oh, you want to get off?